This show is such an enigma. When you edit video footage as an expression, lying to tell the truth, where you manipulate the footage, either the color or the lighting, to be different than just what comes out of the camera, which looks very flat. But you're enhancing what's already there and almost cheating in order to make the viewer feel like they're actually there looking at what the camera originally saw. And the music of this show really does the same thing. This is set in 1482, I think. And if you Googled top 10 composers from 1482, I don't think you recognize any of them, because it was just before the Renaissance. Music was it wasn't very developed to our modern ear. And so composers like Machaut, 100 years before that, or maybe even Josquin, they were trying to move music forward, but it was kind of getting complicated. It didn't have the beauty and the harmony that we now know from the Renaissance. If this musical only used music that would be authentic to the 1480s, it would be an emotional drag, because that type of music is in no way able to capture the full spectrum of emotions that this show requires. And so I think the composer is lying to tell the truth. Some things sound like the 70s or the 80s or the 90s in this show. Some things sound like the 1480s to a modern ear. It's obviously new music, but it sounds old, and it makes you feel like there you are in 1480. The charming French waltz that starts the show wouldn't have existed for hundreds of years after 1482. But we're made to feel like we are there in the moment. This show is very unique in that it calls for a choir to be seated on the stage for the entire production, which is a luxury that we never have in a standard musical. It's the cast who is huffing and puffing and dancing and choreographing and having lines that has to also carry all of the musical weight. Whereas the choir, who are very fine musicians, get to sit there and contribute in a very major, meaningful way, in a way that a traditional cast really couldn't. And a lot of the music that they have is kind of a cross between very sort of dark, gothic sounding harmonies, a lot of fifths and parallelism, which would have been authentic to the 1400s in a very sort of angular and rudimentary way to our modern ear. It's a lot of open fifths, which is how harmony did begin, something called organum, where you'd have a Gregorian chant, which is also, a lot of this music is modeled after chant, where there would be a second line of chant that would simply parallel the first at a set interval. And so a lot of the choir music harkens back to what we might assume was happening in a place like Notre Dame in the 1400s, without really going all the way and giving us the same sort of music that they would have had. The very opening of the show it doesn't sound like Gregorian chant to people that do Gregorian chant all the time, but to the average person that listens to the show, you think, okay, that's got to be chant, and that takes you to a certain place in the willing suspension of disbelief as we travel to Notre Dame in the 1480s. What I think is done so artfully in the show is how the different themes are brought back in. For poor Quasi, when the crowd is just beating him, here comes the theme back of one day out there living in the sun, but it's in a minor key. It's very dark. And then at the very end, here comes the theme, top of the world, and it's such a different setting. But again, that's a way that the music shapes the text and shapes how we feel in that moment, which is the power of any art, is it allows emotion to be communicated. And this is just one of many ways this show does that so beautifully.